Being a pastor, having been called to preach when I was 10, I preached my first sermon when I was 16. By the time I was 21, I was on staff at First Baptist Fort Smith, Arkansas, under Dr. Bennett, who was a legend in that part of the country in those days, back before mega churches had hit the scene. But we were in a large church there, and then at the age of 23, I became the full-time pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Poto, Oklahoma. Any of you ever been to Poto, Oklahoma? Yeah? Okay. Over in the eastern part of the state. Pastored there for 8 years, and then in 1992 moved to Yukon, which is out west of Oklahoma City. Pastored Trinity Baptist Church there for 23 years. 2 years ago, got to be a part of a new church start that we call Liberty Church. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. But I do want you to know that I have a family. I have 2 children, Jake and Rebecca. Jake is a second-year resident up in Tulsa, so he's Dr. Jake now. And my daughter, who is over here at the left, that's Jake, and his wife, Brittany. This is Rebecca. She is a nurse. Her husband, Tony. Have a little girl named Lucy, and this is Reese and Silas, Jake and Brittany's sons. So we have 3 grandchildren. So I am honored to have a family. As I said, I pastor the Liberty Church in Yukon. We're a church that is not afraid to speak the truth. We are not politically correct. I just want you to know that right now. We are, I guess we're incredibly politically incorrect, but we're biblically accurate. And that's what matters, isn't it? And so we are concerned about God's Word and how God's Word applies to everything. I did serve in the legislature for 2 terms from 2012 to 2016. I was unopposed my second term, and I think I would have been unopposed my third term. So you may be asking, why in the world did you walk away? Because I was sick of what I saw. So-called conservative Christians running and getting elected, and then when they got there, they governed as anything but conservative Christians. Now, I'm not questioning anybody's faith, anybody's Christianity. I'm just telling you, it was a disaster. And so I finally told my wife, there has got to be something else that we can do. Well, one of the ministries that I've had for a number of years now, as a part of my pastoring, is telling the story of the Black-Robed Regiment. Those were the preachers of the 18th century who did more than just talk. They walked out onto the battlefields and fought. They recruited the men from their churches and their communities. They preached the whole counsel of God, and when the time came to fight to defend their liberties, they did it. And so I travel around and I tell their story. I've written on them. I have some books with me today if you're interested. And brother, I need to get you a new DVD because we actually hired a film company a couple of years ago, and we made a real for sure docudrama. And so I'll get you a good copy of that today before we leave. But I go around telling this story in period costume, and I become a number of the characters on stage. It's a multimedia presentation. We have a museum that we bring with us where we have artifacts from the war. I've got muskets that I know the soldiers' names that carried them. We have a musket that a private named Isaac Cook carried across the Delaware River with George Washington on December the 25th, 1776. And he used that musket at the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey the very next day. I have a musket carried by William Perkins at the Battle of Bunker Hill. I mean, all this stuff. So when I go and do this presentation, and maybe we want to visit sometime, I'd love to bring that presentation here and do it either on a Sunday morning or Sunday night or whatever. You can invite other churches over. But I tell the story. So I told my wife, I said, look, this legislature is a joke. And so maybe we just need to make the difference pastoring and travel around doing our presentation. So we did. And then early last spring came along, and I had friends and family that started pushing me and saying, Dan, man, you need to consider running for governor. And I laughed at them. I thought it was just a total joke. In fact, one of my best Christian friends from over in Poto, where I pastored for years, called me up and said, man, you got to consider running for governor. And I said, Jim, I didn't know you to be a drinking man. You've been in Uncle Ben's cough medicine again, haven't you, man? You need to kick that habit. And he came to see me, and in tears, he's a big old tall cowboy. I mean, he's the real McCoy, lives out there on a ranch. And just in tears in my driveway, he said, Dan, I'm telling you, I think the Lord wants you to run for governor. So after a long bit of thinking and praying, and my wife and I had hoped we'd do that a couple of weeks, and God would say, nah, and I could just go on about my life and not have to mess with it. That's not what happened. So here I am now, a pastor all my life. I'm 58. I've been full-time pastor for 34 years of those 58 years. I've been preaching since I was 16, so now I've been at it 42 years preaching. I've been a Christian since I was 8. I believe the Bible is God's inerrant word from cover to cover. I believe the gospel is the only answer. And now what in the world am I doing serving 2 terms in the legislature and now I'm running for governor? I mean, that even still sounds crazy. When you said it a while ago, I thought, I'm doing what? I'm running for governor. I mean, it just sounds nuts. Well, there are some reasons for that. Now, some people have said, so Dan, what you actually want to be as a politician? I don't have the slightest desire whatsoever to be a politician, and I want you to know that. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed lately, but politicians rank right down there with used car salesmen and ptomaine poisoning. I mean, they are right down at the bottom of the list. I heard a story of 3 guys were out traveling one night, and they got stranded way out in the country. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what in the world they were going to do. And so they said, well, it's cold, and we're going to freeze to death. We better start walking and try to find some place where we can spend the night. Saw a light in the distance, believed it was a farmhouse, walked up to it. Sure enough, knocked on the door. The farmer answered. They said, listen, man, we're stranded down here, and we're in trouble, and we just need a place to stay the night. Now, it just so happens that one of the 3 of these guys was a politician. The other man was Jewish. The other man was Hindu. And so the farmer said, well, I've got room for 2 of you in the house, but I'm sorry, but one of you's going to stay in the barn. And so they said, okay, well, we can do that. So the Hindu guy said, well, listen, I'll go out and stay in the barn, and you guys sleep in the house. So he goes and gets to the barn, and they all start to bed down. About 10 minutes, another knock at the door. They think, my gosh, who could that be? So the farmer goes to the door, he opens it up, and there's that Hindu gentleman. He says, look, I can't spend the night out there in the barn. There's cattle out there, and that could be some of my relatives, and I just can't do that. And so they said, okay, well, what are we going to do? And the guy that was Jewish said, well, look, I'll sleep in the barn. So, okay, that'll work. So they all start getting ready to bed down again. About 10 minutes. They think, oh my gosh, what could be the problem now? So he opens up the door, and there's the Jewish guy, and he says, man, there's a pig out there in the barn. I cannot spend the night out there with that pig. So finally the politician said, hey, look, I'm supposed to be a servant of the people. I should have volunteered my services first out in the barn, so I'm going to go stay in the barn. Well, everybody says, okay, I think that's going to work. So about 10 minutes later, they're all starting to bed down. Now they cannot believe it. What does the politician have wrong with the barn? They open up the door, and there stands a pig and a cow. So, you just need to know that politicians are not all that popular these days. So I don't want to be one. I can assure you of that. But we do need and are in great, desperate need of some statesmen. We don't have very many of those. Men and women who believe certain core principles, and they're going to do it no matter what. And we desperately need those people. Now, as a pastor, I get to travel around a lot. And one of the things that I don't see enough of is a sense of urgency. And so that's my message today. Where's the urgency? Where is it? Now, you're familiar with Scripture, like Ephesians 5:16, where Paul said, see that you walk circumspectly. That means in wisdom. Not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Or Colossians 4, verse 5, where Paul said, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Now, you can't read the New Testament and not recognize that the Bible says there is a sense of urgency that all of us should have. And if you've been following the news lately, you know the things that are going on in our country, like the U.S. Supreme Court deciding that James Obergefell had the right to force same-sex marriage on the entire country when that's not really even constitutional, ought to say to us that we're facing a time of incredible urgency. The day and evening of that decision handed down by the Supreme Court, then President Barack Obama had the White House lit up in the colors of the rainbow. Now that's God's rainbow. And he used that rainbow as a symbol of his covenant with Noah and Noah's descendants about not ever judging the world by a flood again. And the president has the White House lit up in those colors, and listen to what he had to say. The court ruling has made our union a little more perfect. What? And yet, as I see this happening all around us, and I see what's going on in our culture, I do not see in most churches a sense of urgency. I don't notice pastors urgent about what we need to do. I don't see Christians saying, my gosh, we've got to do something. Now, this is not new. If you go all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, and the Supreme Court then, they decided, of course, that there's just no way that we can allow Bibles in schools. We must get rid of those Bibles. Man, those are the problem. Even though if you look at our early history when we were still colonies and then when we first became states, the Bible was often used as a primer to actually teach reading and writing to boys and girls. And then they said, well, on top of that, we sure can't allow kids to pray in school. Why, my gosh, that sets a bad example. So they said, man, no more prayer. We got to cut out this praying stuff. And then later on, they came along in the 1980s and they said, well, we can't have the Ten Commandments either, because if you hang up the Ten Commandments in a school, why, the kids are apt to read them and obey them. And we sure can't have kids obeying the Ten Commandments. I mean, we don't want kids believing that murder is wrong and lying is wrong and stealing is wrong and adultery is wrong. We can't have that, of course. Now, that was the U.S. Supreme Court. Of course, a lot of us say, well, we live in good old conservative Oklahoma. Well, our state Supreme Court is no better. Just not long ago, they decided that, why, it's just simply unconstitutional, according to the Oklahoma Constitution, to allow a monument commemorating the Ten Commandments. And you don't have to be a historian to know that the Ten Commandments have contributed greatly to the legal history of our culture. And this monument, by the way, was purchased and erected with private dollars. It wasn't costing the state one thin dime. It was just taking up a little spot on the Capitol grounds, and it was actually in a relatively obscure place on top of it. But that Supreme Court said, oh, no, according to the Blaine Amendment, you can't have anything like this. And I'm convinced that the Blaine Amendment was never intended to rid us of our faith and our heritage. Now, all of this is going on, and we just don't seem to have any sense of urgency. Now, you may. I can't condemn you. I don't know where you really stand on this, but I'm telling you, as I go all over Oklahoma, and not just Oklahoma, all over the country, I do not sense a real urgency. I mean, every now and then we'll kind of sense it in a presidential election, but in the end, it's just not there. Now, some of you are probably familiar with this gentleman. His name is Josh Mcdowell. Josh is probably one of the premier apologists in our country. He has done a great favor to the church in authoring books that he's authored that help us to defend our faith and to back up the claims of Scripture. Well, a few years ago, he wrote a book entitled The Last Christian Generation. He was asking the question, are we now living in the last Christian generation? From this point on, we're going to become so much less Christian that Christians will be minimalized. Now, here was the premise of his book. They researched hundreds of the lives of young people who had grown up not in pagan homes, in Christian homes like ours, had gone to church. They researched them because these young adults now were jettisoning their faith. They were turning their backs on the faith that they'd grown up with. And here's what he found among those who grew up in our own Christian homes. 63% do not believe Jesus is the Son of the one true God. 51% do not believe Jesus rose from the dead. 65% do not believe Satan is a real entity. 68% don't believe the Holy Spirit is a real entity. 70% do not believe in absolute moral truth. And by the way, just a side note there. For these people who walk around saying, I believe in moral relativism and, that's your truth, this is my truth, there's an easy way to prove they don't really believe that. If it's a woman, grab her purse and take off with it. And she'll start screaming, yelling, hey, that's my purse. She'll become a moral absolutist immediately. Then you just turn around and look at her and say, well, that's not my truth. And then just walk on with her purse. I guarantee you, she will show you that she believes in moral absolutes. But these young people growing up in our churches, 70% of them don't believe in moral absolutes. 58% believe that all faiths teach equally valid truths. 65% suspect that there's no way to tell which religion is right. Now, Think about that. They're claiming that all religions are the same. All religions are not even the same when they talk about where we go when we die. Have you ever read how the Buddhists define heaven? Have you ever read what the Hindus say heaven is like? Do you know what the Muslims say heaven is like? Very different from what the New Testament and, of course, the Old Testament, what Christianity teaches heaven is like. We don't even agree on where we're going. And yet you hear people say, well, it doesn't matter about all religions trying to get everybody to the same place. No, they're not. By their own admission, they're not trying to get everybody to the same place. And yet 65% of these young people who grew up in our homes, in our churches, said that, well, just no way to tell. And then last, 68% believe that a good person who doesn't accept the fundamental teachings of Christianity can still attain salvation and go to heaven, even though they'd been taught all their lives that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by Him. Now, how is this possible? How is it possible that we are losing our Christian culture? Until recently, 55 to 66% of young people said that church would play a significant role in their lives once they left home. Today, only 33% say that. 33%. Now, here's even a more startling and terrifying statistic. Depending on whose numbers you look at, somewhere between 69, so that's basically 70%, and 94% of our young people are denying the faith as soon as they leave our homes. Christians. We're not talking about pagans. They don't have any faith. We're talking about Christians. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Let it soak in. What does that say about our very near future if 94 or 95% of our young people are rejecting the faith by the time they leave home? Now you can see why Josh McDowell asks, is this the last Christian generation? He goes on to say it's not that they haven't embraced a version of Christianity, it's simply that the version they believe in is not built on the true foundation of what biblical Christianity is all about. It is evident that the church and Christian families are failing to lead them into a transforming experience with God. They read from the same Bible, talk of a personal relationship with God, say biblical truth is important to their lives, but their beliefs and behavior are not consistent with what the Bible identifies as a true follower of Christ. Let me put it simply. They're not Christians. They just talk it, but they're not Christian. But it's not just Josh McDowell. So for those who would say, well, Josh is just being really critical. Oh, no. Other Christian pollsters have found the same information. George Barna, who is another great Christian, he's an apologist, he has found that only 9% of those who claim to be born again actually have a biblical worldview. 9%. And then he goes on to discover that 98% of professed born-again young people believe in Christ, but they do not reflect Christ-like attitudes. In other words, they're not Christians either. You cannot, the entire book of 1 John is dedicated to this premise. You cannot claim to be a believer and a follower of Christ and yet not follow Christ. I mean, duh. You don't even have to have a degree from seminary to know that if you don't follow Christ, you're not a Christ follower. And yet, people claim, I'm Christian, they'll use Christianese, but their lives don't reflect it. Now, guys, I don't know about you, but this terrifies me. Not for me. It's for my kids and my grandkids. It terrifies me. Immediately, I feel this sense of urgency. Now, couple that problem with a prevailing problem in the church. It may not be prevailing here, but I'm telling you guys, in the average Southern Baptist church, and for that matter, I speak in a lot of other different churches like Assemblies of God and others, in practically every church, there is this unbelievable embrace and death stranglehold that we have on this myth of separation of church and state. This idea that you can't talk about anything that even sounds political from the pulpit. And so unfortunately now we have an entire church that believes that church and state never intersect. There's never a point at which those two come together. Now, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Abraham Lincoln for a number of reasons that we could discuss later. But he faced a real crisis in his day. It was called slavery. And he became very frustrated because he was being told that there was just no good place you could talk about it. And in 1860, in a speech in New Haven, Connecticut, he said this. He was criticizing, actually, the people who were saying this. He said, you say we must not call it, slavery, wrong in politics because that's bringing morality into politics. And we must not call it wrong in the pulpit because that is bringing politics into religion. We must not call it, bring it into the tract society. That'd be a parachurch ministry today. Or the other societies because those are such unsuitable places. And there is no single place, according to you, where this wrong thing can be properly called wrong. Do you remember the commercial where a person would be carrying a chocolate bar and another person carrying a jar of peanut butter and they run into each other? And the chocolate bar gets stuck down with the peanut butter, and when the guy pulls it out, he says, you got peanut butter on my chocolate. And the other guy says, holding the peanut butter jar, well, you got chocolate in my peanut butter. And of course, it's Reese's peanut butter cups, right? That's exactly what we're doing and what was going on even in Lincoln's day. People tell me, Dan, you can't talk about stuff like this in the pulpit because you're bringing politics into religion. So if I talk about abortion, if I talk about same-sex marriage, if I talk about our government stealing from us and throwing our money away in corporate welfare and crony capitalism, they say that's political. I thought those were moral issues. Then if I get outside the church, now that I'm running for governor or when I was in the legislature, and I start talking about moral principles, you know what the other crowd says? Well, you can't bring religion into government. Well, you're mixing religion into our politics. So I've discovered that wherever you go, there's somebody saying you can't say that. And I think it's also important for us to know that this whole separation of church and state myth, it's a total myth, actually comes from an obscure letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote on January the 1st, 1802. That's actually a digitized copy of that letter. Now, you may know all of this, but if you don't, you need to know it. If you do know it, you need to repeat it. There was a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who had heard a rumor that President Jefferson was going to declare some denomination the national church. And these Baptists in Connecticut were really concerned about that. So he wrote him a letter and said, man, is this really true? He writes a letter back and he says, no. In fact, there is a wall right there in that section of the letter. He says there is a wall that has been erected by the First Amendment. In fact, here's exactly what he says. Religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. If you read the man's letter in context, you know what he's saying? He's saying there is a wall, all right, and the wall protects the church from the state. Not the other way around. But in the 1960s, some very crafty scholars and politicians took that letter, took it completely out of context, flipped it upside down, and said that what Jefferson was saying is that there's a wall that separates government from the church, and you shouldn't ever mix any kind of religion or faith in government. How many times have you heard somebody say, you cannot legislate morality? Well, what do you legislate then? The weather? Legislate dirt? I mean, what else can you legislate? Guys, all legislation is legislated morality. The only question is whose morality is going to get legislated. That's the only question. Because somebody is going to legislate their morality. This is why we were birthed to begin with as a culture that we know of as the American culture. It's very important that we get this. Now, the easiest way that I know how to illustrate how God set this up so that we could have Christian culture is that He knew we needed some institutions to help us have that. So just imagine a stool, and the top of that stool is a civil society. That's what we all want. We don't want to kill each other. We don't want to shoot at each other. I want to be able to leave my home and go to town and get a Big Mac or a Whopper and not have to worry that while I'm gone, somebody's going to come in there and ransack the whole thing, right? So we want to live in a civil society. Well, God says since man is fallen, you're going to have some institutions to do that. So here's what you need. You need the home, you need the state, and you need the church. Now, what those do is they operate like three legs to a stool. Now, if you've ever sat on a three-leg stool, and I'm sure you have, they're very stable. The problem is, though, you don't have any legs to spare. You lose a leg, it's no longer stable, right? Now, if you've got some really good balance, you can kind of, but I mean, if you're in some, on a ship and in rough water or winds blowing or whatever, I mean, a two-leg stool is just not a whole lot of use, right? Okay, so God sets up these institutions. They're all underpinned in Scripture. Unfortunately, for the last 50 or 75 or so years, maybe even 100, we've been telling preachers and Christians, now you cannot talk about government at church, even though it's God's institution. Adrian Rogers once said, the pastor over in Memphis, for years, he's in heaven now, God created human government. It's inconceivable that God would create human government and tell His people to stay out of it. But that's exactly what we've been doing. So now, instead of a three-leg chair, we got a two-leg chair. And that doesn't work. You know it doesn't work. I know it doesn't work. You look around you, and we've got a mess. Now, we have a republic here, not a democracy. We need to use the right terminology. You don't live in a democracy. It's a democratic form of government in that the people have a say, but it's more than that. We live in a republic. And do you know what the two columns are that hold up our republic so we can meet here today without worrying about armed military coming in here and arresting us for saying something that they don't agree with? There are two pillars that hold up our republic, morality and religion. You say, well, Dan, that's your opinion. Well, it's not just my opinion. The father of our country, in his farewell address in 1796, here's what he said. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. And by the way, when he said religion, he didn't mean Buddhism. George Washington was referring to Christianity and in general the Judeo-Christian worldview. Wasn't just him. Second President of the United States, John Adams. Listen to what he said in 1798. He wrote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by," and here it is, "morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." Now catch this last sentence. Many of you are very familiar, but you need to catch it. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Have you ever wondered why nobody seems to be able to make sense out of our founding documents? It's because they were written for a moral and religious people. So since they no longer make sense, would that not be a pretty good indicator that we're no longer a moral and religious people? Urgency. Urgency. So who is going to stand up and say, that's not true? Or are we just going to let it keep going on? Are we just going to keep huddling tighter in our churches thinking that we're safe inside our walls when the world outside around us is becoming more and more pagan every single day? Who is going to put their finger on the pulse of that culture and say there is an answer? Now, I told you a while ago that I've spent a good deal of my life over the last 8 to 10 years researching about a time in America when it wasn't that way. When the church was like the tip of the spear. We weren't afraid of running somebody off. We didn't want to run anybody off, I'm sure they didn't, but that's not what motivated them. They were not more interested in what was in the offering plate than what was in the heart and the head. They weren't politically correct. Now, those preachers fearlessly preached. We call them the Black Robe Regiment. I'm telling you, if you don't know about those people, you need to find out about them. Because they're why you have the liberties and freedoms that you have today. I know they were given to us by God, but bad people are going to take them away from us if we don't guard them. And these men stood in their pulpits Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, encouraging their people that the Bible gives the answers to life, and standing there in their black robes, wearing their preaching bands, which of course is where the title came from that the British threw on them, warned their people that you must be vigilant about guarding your liberties or bad people will take them away. And then we won't have the freedom to preach the gospel. We'll be force-fed some other philosophy. A Methodist bishop in the late 1800s, in referring to those men, said this: mighty men they were, of iron nerve and strong hand and unblanched cheek and heart of flame. Now I want to stop there. Is that how you would describe most preachers you know today? I wouldn't use any of those words for most of my fellow pastors. And I love them, and I'm not trying to be judgmental or critical, but I wouldn't use mighty men, iron nerve, strong hand, unblanched cheek, heart of flame. I'd use corporate, ambitious, career-minded. Those are the terms I'd use. God needed not reeds shaken by the wind, not men clothed in soft raiment, but heroes of hardihood and lofty courage to be the voice of a new kingdom crying in this western wilderness. You say, well, Dan, I didn't know we're just going to get a history lesson today. We're getting to it. But you understand, we are what we are because of what we've been. And none of us, or at least few of us, know what we've been. We have the slightest idea what we are, and therefore we have no idea where we're going. It's a shame. It's just a shame. I've watched preachers, with your pastor accepted. I'm not here to blast your pastor. I think he's probably very different. Proof of it's that he'd have an idiot like me in his pulpit on a Sunday morning. But I've watched pastors. I've talked to them. You know, when I give these black robe presentations, it's an amazing thing. I have people come up to me after it's over, and it's a pretty stirring presentation. I don't mean to sound presumptuous, but it's pretty stirring. And people come up to me and they'll have tears just running down their cheeks. And here's what they always say: Dan, how can I get my pastor to talk about these things? And they're just crying their eyes out. Do you know I have yet, at one of those events, to have a pastor come up to me with tears running down his cheeks saying, Dan, how do I mobilize my church? Do you get the problem? Our leaders have compromised. They do it at your capital. I watched it firsthand. A lot of these jokers that come to you when they're campaigning saying, I'm pro-life, just as soon as they get there behind closed doors, they kill bills that might even have a chance of ending abortion. Oh, now they'll let a few slip out and they'll vote for those. They won't really make any difference, but they'll vote for those so they can come back to you and say, see, I voted for that pro-life measure and I voted for that pro-life measure. The truth is, behind closed doors, they're killing the stuff that you actually sent them up there to do. Isn't it a shame that our leaders have become so compromising? Barna did a study with pastors. He asked pastors, he said, is the Bible clear on the social ills of our time? And these pastors all, like 97% of them, said the Bible is incredibly clear and very bold. Then he asked them, are you going to preach on them? And they said, not a chance. What? The Bible's clear and you're not going to talk about them. So he started asking these preachers, why? Here are the two top reasons that pastors themselves gave for not preaching about controversial issues today. The first reason, they said, we're afraid it'll hurt our church attendance. And the second reason, they said, we're afraid it'll hurt our offerings. Barna went on to say, you know, in their proper place, I guess there's nothing wrong with those, but I don't recall Jesus having died for either one of them. And yet that's why most pastors today refuse to talk about the things that I talk about because they're afraid it's going to make somebody mad and they'll lose a member or they'll lose some of that precious offering that comes in on that offering plate. Guys, how cheaply are we willing to sell out our faith? How cheaply are we willing to do it? Now, many of you probably know Chuck Swindoll. He's been a great preacher and teacher over the years. He was talking one day about men and women who are willing to make a difference and go against the tide. And I think this quote is worth your hearing, so I want to give it to you. He says, "We salute visionaries of yesteryear. They emerged from the pages of our history books as men and women of gallant faith. We shake our heads in amazement as we imagine the Herculean courage it took to stand so confidently when the majority frowned so sternly. Looking back, we laud those who refused to take no for an answer. We quote them with gusto. Why, we even name our children after them." But then he goes on to say, "What do we do with such creatures today? We brand them as irritating malcontents, reckless idealists who simply won't sit down and shut up. Don't expect pats on the back or great waves of applause," he says, "if you go against the tide. Not today. Chances are good you'll lose a few jobs, fail a few courses, ruffle tons of feathers, and be the subject of the town gossip. But take heart. Many an alleged heretic today will be a hero tomorrow," which is another way of saying first the cross and then the crown. Where did the men of gallantry and vision and courage go in our churches? How is it that we have allowed ourselves to be reduced to just to a bunch of sniveling peasants who bow at the benevolent offerings of some government, whether it's in Washington or 23rd and Lincoln? We talk about, well, the state owns this and the state owns that. The state doesn't own anything. We have a representative republic. They govern by the consent of the governed. This is we the people, government of, by, and for the people. You are the state. And as Christians, we ought to let our voices be heard. I guarantee you the atheists do. When I was there at the Capitol, every possible crazy group you can imagine, fringe, it doesn't matter, they made their voices known. You know the only group that was generally absent in any kind of loud way? Christians. We're not there. Oh, we show up at Rose Day and pass out a few roses. But other than that, that's it. So I've got to ask a question then. When all of this social engineering and upheaval started occurring in the 50s and the 60s, where in the world was the church? I mean, where were we? Now, I grew up in Arkansas. Please don't hold that against me. Bill Clinton did too. He's a little older than me, but he grew up in the state where I grew up, so I'm somewhat familiar with him. He claims that the entire time that he was attending Baptist churches while growing up in Arkansas, he never heard one sermon on the evils of abortion, and therefore he believed that abortion was just the right of a woman to choose. Because he said, I never had a sermon on it. Well, you know, I grew up later than him, but I grew up in Arkansas. My pastor was Brother Gilbert. We went to a little church there in Van Buren, a little Baptist church, and he was a godly man. He believed the Bible. I'm convinced that Brother Gilbert would have hated abortion. Now, you got to understand, I was born in 1959, okay? Well, Roe v. Wade was in 1973, so I would have been 14. Well, surely there was a huge debate going on in the culture before the Supreme Court said abortion's legal everywhere at all times, right? So you would think that maybe when I was 11 or 12 or 13, there had been a lot of sermons being preached by pastors from pulpits. Abortion is murder, and we cannot allow it to become legal in America. So I started thinking back. You know what? I don't recall ever having heard one sermon in all of those years on the evils of abortion. Not one. Now, former President Clinton and the truth seem to hardly ever connect, but maybe at this one juncture, he's telling the truth. Maybe he didn't hear a sermon on the evils of abortion. Now, my campaign has 4 planks. Our platform has 4 planks. Now, we care about everything, but there are 4 things that we care a whole lot about. And the most important one is abortion. Because I believe it is the murder of a human being who bears the image of God and should be treated like murder. And I also believe that any culture that is capable of murdering the most innocent among us. Now, we all know that even though they're innocent, they're still conceived in sin. The Bible teaches this, but they've not committed any sins yet. So they're the most innocent among us. Any culture that will willingly allow those babies to be murdered in their midst, I believe is capable of any kind of evil. Is it a big step to go from murdering unborn babies to murdering old people? No. There's no step at all. Is it a big step to go from murdering babies to murdering those who have mental handicaps and challenges? No. Or physical handicaps and challenges? No. See, the point is, a culture that's willing to murder the unborn is really not all that far removed from the Nazis in Germany that were trying to eliminate an entire group of people. Now, I know we don't like that. I don't like that. You don't like that. Nobody likes to hear that. But I'm telling you, friends, we're not much further from that. You remember reading about how the coal miners used to take a canary in a cage down into the coal mine with them? Back in the days before they had instruments that could tell if the air had become lethal with gases that were mixing into the oxygen. Yeah, they'd carry these bird cages down into the coal mines, and if that canary stopped singing, if it stopped moving around, those guys knew they were breathing toxic fumes. Well, I would suggest to you that abortion, being made legal in 1973, and then for 44, now we're working on 45 years, we've sat by and let it happen, was our canary in the coal mine moment. We have been breathing poisonous gases ever since. And I'm telling you, it's only a matter of time before that culture dies. So we better get serious about this. Now, just very quickly, let me run through some numbers and I'll begin to head toward a few points I want you to walk away with, and then we'll be done. First of all, I want you to remember, and the numbers keep changing on us because they keep going up. We've murdered somewhere between 58 and 60 million babies since 1973. But don't think Oklahoma's immune. We murder 15 to 20 babies every business day in Oklahoma. That's about 5,000 or so a year that we know of, right here in Oklahoma. 4 freestanding killing centers that the media calls abortion clinics. There's nothing clinical about them. They're killing centers. One of them exists because our own governor vetoed a bill that could have possibly pushed us toward down the road of ending abortion. We don't know, but she vetoed it. So a few weeks ago, we went over to that clinic and we actually dedicated it and called it the Mary Fallon Abortion Clinic, so that she could have that as a legacy for her. And here's what I discovered in our conservative legislature. I discovered that those in our state government only seek to regulate the slaughter. They don't intend to end it. Friends, I'm telling you, it is time to stop regulating murder and abolish it. That's why I no longer call myself a pro-lifer. Now, I know that a lot of good people call themselves pro-life, but I don't anymore. Now, let me explain that. When I was at First Baptist, it was in the early 80s, we were working closely with Dr. Jerry Falwell in the Moral Majority. He would actually fly into Fort Smith and meet with us. I got to meet him. And that was back in their heyday. And see, in those days, when we said we were pro-life, we knew that meant we wanted to end abortion, right? But here's what I discovered. In the years since the early 80s and 2012, when I got elected, something's happened. Because when politicians tell you they're pro-life, it doesn't mean they're going to go end abortion. Now, they may personally think it's wrong and think it ought to end, but as a politician, they're not going to pay the political price to suggest that we ought to end abortion. Then why do they tell you that? Because they want you to vote for them. So I have found out that today, among at least the elites and the governing class, pro-life doesn't mean a doggone thing. So I'm not a pro-lifer anymore. I'm an abolitionist. I believe it's time to abolish it. It always was. I just thought pro-life meant that. I didn't realize that it had changed. And you say, well, Dan, that's pretty tough talk. Yeah, it is. But it comes straight from God. In Proverbs chapter 6, here's what God says. He hates those who shed innocent blood. In Proverbs 24, listen to what he says here. He says, we have a responsibility as Christians to deliver those who are drawn toward death and hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. Well, isn't that a pretty good description of someone going toward an abortion clinic to murder their baby? He goes on, I'm not going to take the time to read it, where he says, and I know this is going on. Don't say you don't know. Friends, I believe that the church is the only entity, let me get this to click here. I believe the church is the only force, the only entity that can and should end abortion. We shouldn't be counting on judges or the legislature. You know what ought to be happening? The church in Oklahoma. You say, well, I don't know, is there enough of us? Well, I don't know if that matters, should it? But let me tell you, there are enough. You know how many people live in Oklahoma? 3.9 million. Do you know how many claim to be evangelical? That doesn't count Catholics and other faith groups, just evangelicals. 1.3 million. 1/3 of the state claims to be evangelical. You're telling me that 1.3 million people could not make enough racket and could not put enough pressure on our legislature and our governor that they would stand up and do the right thing? Yeah, we could, but we don't. We don't. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm just trying to tell you that's the truth. We don't. Now, you know James says in James 4:17, he that knows to do good and doesn't do it has sinned. We've sinned. So unfortunately, we've opted to believe these politicians when they come to us telling us how pro-life they are. Now remember, guys, I'm pro-life has come to mean absolutely nothing to most politicians. And I can tell you I saw it from the back rooms. Let me give you an example. Since 1973, Roe v. Wade, over 240 pro-life measures have become law across the states. And yet abortion is legal in every state. Now you tell me incrementalism is working. Most pro-life legislation simply ensures that abortion remains legal. It just puts a few obstacles in the path. That's why I say it's time to abolish it. Stop trying to nip around the edges. Stop trying to incrementally end abortion. It isn't working. In 44 years of incrementalism, here's what we have to show for it: 60 million dead babies. Guys, and we stand and sing, God bless America. How in the world can God bless a culture that has murdered in the last 44 years 60 million of its unborn babies? And the church is so powerful. So I'm telling you, it's time for you and for me to become abolitionists. Now, in the little bit of time I have left, I want to remind you of something. In the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, we were battling with slavery. Abortion is our modern day slavery issue. Except it's worse. Slavery is horrible, but abortion is murder. So we've had murder to horrible. There were two groups of people in America in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s that thought slavery was wrong. One group was called anti-slavery. Well, they believed it was wrong and ought to end. There was another group called the abolitionists. They believed slavery was wrong and ought to end. You say, well, they both agreed. Not quite. The anti-slavery group believed it was wrong and ought to end, but they weren't going to do a doggone thing to end it. They were just going to tell everybody how bad it was and wish it would come to an end. The abolitionists, they'd die to end it. That's the difference. That's the difference. Today, anti-slavery is pro-life. Abolitionists are still abolitionists. You end this evil. You don't play with it. Now, there's lots of other stuff that we need to fix in this culture, and I know that. But if we don't fix that, does it matter what else we fix? I mean, really? Now, very quickly then, let me wind it down here. Matthew 5, verse 13. Matthew 5, verses 14 and 16. You know, Jesus says we're salt and light, right? Salt retards decay. Light reduces darkness. We're supposed to be retarding decay in our culture, and we're supposed to be shining the light. In fact, to the Christians at a place called Philippi, Paul said, you guys shine like lights to a dark, crooked, and perverse generation. Is that what we really are? Are we really lights? Are we really salt? I'm telling you guys, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm really not. This is why I'm running for governor. Somebody's got to say this stuff. I know it's not popular. I know it's hurtful. I know that this is not the kind of sugar stick sermon that most pastors want to preach and makes everybody feel better about themselves, and we all walk out slapping each other on the back. Well, we're going to go get some chicken, after church. I get all that. And I can tell you that running for governor hadn't been a barrel of monkeys, for sure. So what must we do? Well, three things, very quickly. If you want to jot these down, jot them down. The church must be the definer of truth, guys. You cannot let the world define the truth because they'll lie about the truth and therefore it's not true, right? We have the truth. We must be the definers of the truth. Judges 17:6 says that there was a time in Israel when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We can't have that. Everything's not right. Two opposing views of the same thing can't both be right. Okay? Can't. It's a paradox. Second thing, the church must not only be the definer of the truth, we must be the deliverer of the truth. If we don't deliver the truth, no one else will. You think the media is going to deliver the truth? You think this esteemed government is going to deliver the truth? You think the infallible Supreme Court is going to tell the truth? Well, tell that to Dred Scott in 1857 when our infallible Supreme Court determined that a black person is not a person but property. Tell that to the individuals who are forcibly sterilized because of a Supreme Court decision by our infallible Supreme Court in 1927 that said that you can force certain Americans to be sterilized. Tell that to our infallible Supreme Court that in 1944 ruled that it's okay to round up citizens. Now they're of Japanese descent, but they're a number of generations removed and they're citizens. It's okay to forcibly remove them, put them in internment camps where they lose their homes, their businesses, and many of their families are separated and never reunited. You telling me that's right? And you go right down the list. Who's going to tell you the truth? God will. This is why Jesus told the disciples in Matthew 28:20, teaching them to observe all things I've told you. In other words, the truth. Paul put it like this in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. Speak the truth. That's what we must put. And then last of all, the church must be the defender of the truth. No one else is going to do that. No one else is going to defend the truth. We have to do it. Jude tells us to do that in Jude 1:3. Paul tells us to watch, stand fast in 1 Corinthians 16. He tells us the same thing in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, Paul tells us that the devil, like a roaring lion, is going to seek whom he can devour. We have to be sober and vigilant. So, what's the final line here? Well, God says that He has a wall. Now, in Israel, it was a literal wall. But God says that His people are like a wall that protects good people from bad people. And He says the church, His spokesmen, are like the watchmen on that wall. And our job is when we see the enemy approaching to blow the warning. In fact, in the book of Ezekiel chapter 33, God says, if you do that, you're innocent, no matter what happens. But if you don't blow the alarm, I'm going to hold you accountable. And then in Isaiah chapter 56, God said, well, my people are my watchdogs. The only problem is they're watchdogs that can't bark. Now you tell me, what good is a watchdog that's lost its ability to bark? Is he any good at all? He says, and on top of it, not only do they not bark, all they do is sleep and eat. Does that not sound horribly reminiscent of the church today? Yeah. Yeah. How'd that work out for Israel? Not so good. A last story. There's a lady named Penny Lee that used to travel around the country talking about how horrible abortion is. At the end of one of her talks, she said an old gentleman walked up to her and he was crying. And he was speaking to her in English with a very strong German accent. And he said, you know, I was living in Germany when the Nazis were in charge. And Penny Lee had just compared abortion and what was going on in abortion in America to what was going on with the Nazis in Germany. And the old man said, you know, I attended a church that sat right beside a set of railroad tracks. And trains every now and then would run by our church when we were having church. And he said, then one Sunday, we noticed the strangest thing. As a train went by, we heard people crying. Crying. We thought, well, who is that? We went outside. The train was gone. There was no one. And then next Sunday, there was another train, more crying. Only this time, we ran outside before the train was gone, and we learned what was going on. There were people on those trains in boxcars, cattle cars, crowded in there, and they were begging and crying for someone to help them. He said, we were terrified by this. It was awful. And he said it got to where every Sunday, a train would come by carrying these people. We even knew what time the train would come by, and he said, we knew that we had to do something about it. You know what their solution was? He said, since we knew what time the train would come by, we'd start singing louder and we'd turn up the organ so we couldn't hear the cries of the people. The old man said, well, it wasn't long after that, we found out where those people were being taken and what was happening to them. He said, Mrs. Lee, it's been years now. I'm an old man. I can still hear those cries. I can still hear the cries of those people on those trains. Now, we all know where those trains were going, right? Yeah. And when the Allied forces finally broke through, we know what they found. We've seen the pictures. Oddly enough, in the modern church today, if you talk about abortion, don't show any pictures. Why do we always say that? Don't show any pictures. Well, there's two reasons. Number one, it's awful. It's just awful. But secondly, we don't want to be reminded of how awful it is. There's a church in Germany, in Lubeck, Germany. When they were renovating this church years ago, they scraped off the plaster of the walls, and they found that someone years before had written an inscription on the wall underneath. I want you to hear what this inscription says. You call me master and obey me not. You call me light and see me not. You call me the way and you walk me not. You call me life and you live me not. You call me wise, but you follow me not. You call me rich and ask me not. You call me eternal and seek me not. All those are paradoxes, aren't they? Listen to the last line. If I condemn thee, blame me not. Friends, I'm telling you, it's time for urgency. It's time for the Church of Jesus Christ in Oklahoma to stand up as a powerful voice, an army of the living God, armed in the armor of light. And as Paul told Timothy, fight the good fight as a good soldier of the Lord Jesus. Remember, when you were born again, you weren't placed on a playground. God positioned you on a battlefield. The old ship of Zion is not a cruise ship. It's a battleship. We're in a war here against darkness, against principalities, against wickedness in high places. It's our job to do what is right. So I'm not here necessarily to ask you to vote for me. I'd appreciate your support. But let me tell you what I'm here to tell you. If we don't stand up and say so as the church, we're going to lose our voice to say so. You say, yeah, but we've got Trump as a president. Regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, I think he has given us just a little reprieve. But that window is small. I was talking with the president of the largest Christian university in Oklahoma just the other day. I want to tell you what he told me. He said, Dan, we were getting ready to close our university down. I said, what? We're getting ready to close it down. He said, we were being told by inside information that if Hillary Clinton was elected president, she was going to defund any grants and government loans or government secured loans for any students attending Christian colleges or universities. He said, now we don't take any federal money here, but our students get grants and government secured loans. And many of them could not go to school here if they didn't. And he said, Dan, we would cease to exist. We were getting ready to shut this university down. And he said, lo and behold, miracle of miracles. A guy that most of us had a problem with during the campaigns, but a guy named Donald Trump was elected. And we got a second chance. Friends, I'm telling you, we've got a second chance. If we blow this one, I'm not sure there'll be a third. It's time. It's past time.